Okay, I'm not able to.
There we go.
All right. Welcome everyone to the Plan Stage group sync. We're going to use the time today to go through the planning objects kickoff part 2, but I wanted to welcome Melissa to the call. She's our new group product manager in Plan, and it's exciting to have her on the team. She's going to give us a lot of great guidance as PMs and just how we can structure our strategy overall. So it's awesome to have her here.
Thanks, Kristen, and hi, everyone. I'll reach out to each of y'all because I do want to have coffee chats with everyone. It's going to take me time to get through everyone. But in the meantime, if you want to just drop something on my calendar, please feel free to do so. About me, I'm in Austin, Texas. I've been with GitLab for about a year. And prior to this, I was working in managed access. So I may have interacted with some of you in issues, but maybe not. But excited to be here.
Hey, Melissa, is your 2 weeks CTO shadow over?
Yeah, so funny thing is I started my role 3 weeks ago, but then I had signed up to be CEO shadow basically after my first week on this job, but now I'm back. It was a really great experience. If any of you are interested in learning more, I'm happy to chat offline about it, but it was really good. You should all sign up.
I can also advocate for that. It was life-changing to do that CEO shadow position. Highly recommend. Okay, let's jump over to the other agenda from last week, which I linked. I started it off at the beginning. I wanted to just mention that after our last call, and we can scroll down and look at the notes from last call, we didn't get through very much, but there was a lot of risk that was highlighted, included being blocked by the migration of projects and epics, and a lot around how big the migration would be and how much work it is to get the goal of epics being live in 6 months. It just seemed kind of insurmountable from my side as I was reading through. And I worked a little with Justin to try to think about how to break this down or make it more achievable from a product standpoint, because we're really looking at like an additional 6 to even 12 months of risk based on just looking at where things are at and how big this is. And so I've added a proposal to break this down smaller and to change my goal, which was have epics live in 6 months, to just working on a project level planning object that I'm going to call story for this MVC. And I'll walk you through it so you can sort of hear my thinking. So there's been, and if you want to see some background from product, there's a YouTube video where Scott, Anoop, and Justin talk about hard cutovers and migrations in their careers and how hard that's been for teams. And ours was essentially rolling up to be a hard cutover because we had to have APIs switch, we had to have customers switch over to this new UI, and they're relying on epics and issues for their daily work, and a migration, and have that all kind of come together in a grand symphony or like a moment where we would just cut over. And so to de-risk that, well, I'll just go through this. So the original was a full epic migration in 6 months. Looking at all of the feedback and just talking to some of the teams, there was going to be a really long timeline with tons of risk. So we wouldn't be able to really lock it in and tell our customers when things were happening. It would have a need for precision and perfection with our existing users. We would have to support multi-level epics from day one, which also adds a lot onto what we would need to finish from a coding perspective to deliver. We would have a big migration. We'd have to support the old APIs. And then the burden on users for a large cutover where we may just have UI bugs to work out. What I mean by that is like, we're going to be testing this new layout for issues, and like just having our current customers suddenly have that be on their epics would be a lot more noise for them while we work out the small things. And it just adds risk to our customers. So what I'm proposing is a small MVC of a project level story object, which would essentially behave like a single level epic in the project space instead of the group space. So we can do this ahead of the merging of projects and groups. We can be more iterative. We can try it sooner. We can run parallel paths and don't gate ourselves by the group and project merge. We can be iterative in the sense of figuring out single level objects first and then multi-level parents, which I'm going to call features. So we would have stories, which would be a single level object. Features would be just like multi-level epics. We wouldn't touch the APIs that are relied on by our customers, like epics. We could try it sooner. And then we avoid this magic and stress of a flip the switch day and just basically get up with something that no one is really relying on at this point. And we could even do it all behind a feature flag for a few releases for our team just to get it up and running, that story object. And we would make sure in the docs that we make it clear that that object's in beta or some minimal maturity and not suggested for business use until we get it to a point where we feel comfortable. And so these MVCs are all up for iteration. These are just me thinking this through. And so this is why I'd really like the team's input as well. But I'm just going to talk through each, how I could see it initially chunking down. And then I'm sure you all have some other ideas. These are not written in stone. So this is just a diagram of what I was explaining, but essentially we would leave epics at group level as is. They could still relate to issues. And we would just work on this new story object, single level. So we could work on list views, details views, URLs, having them render on issue boards, template hierarchies behind the scene, scalable URLs, tracking, things like that. MVC2, we could layer in that multi-level epic. We would already have parenting figured out for one level. Then it's figuring out how do we have up to 7. So this is essentially building the multi-level epics that's at group, making sure this works on the new system where we could go to 7 levels deep. And again, supporting that in these different views. MVC3 is starting to render these on different areas together. So up until now, we usually just either render an epic and or an issue on a board, but now suddenly we can, these are all going to be issue types, so we could start rendering stories and other things on our roadmaps or other places around the app. And then once we're unblocked by the merging of groups and projects, or whenever that happens, or whenever it makes sense to the team, then we could, and we know the structure, then we can start this migration effort. And I'm willing to add to the guesstimated time, I know we said 6 months just to tell our customers moving back for this whole thing. I'm going to be adding another 3 months to support the epic migration at the end. So it gives us time to figure out how all of these objects will work and be scalable, and then have its own phase to do a migration and figure out how that will work for our customers. So yeah, I wanted to just get the team's take on that, see if it makes sense. It's a departure from the big pushover to epics, but I'm just curious to hear from the engineering team your thoughts on that. And if it makes sense, or if there's any way we could tweak it to make it even more iterative.
Thanks, Kristen. Just a first thought or question: what is the exactly difference between story and epic objects? Supposing that in MVC4 or whenever, basically both can live on project level. So what will be the differentiation between both?
Yeah, so they're going to behave the same way. And essentially any object that has children would behave like an epic. So it really comes down to what we call it. So at the time of migration, we could call stories project level epics if we wanted to retain them, and we could talk to our customers. and then have epics be the ones that live at group. So we could have them side by side in the issue type table. The other thing we could do is explore renaming earlier for our customers if they want to set up their own hierarchy of objects and what they call them and modify names. We could explore allowing that to happen sooner as well.
Thanks. So the idea is that the end goal is to basically deprecate epics and replace this with stories once we support this project group consolidation.
Well,
did I get it right, or?
Technically, but the old object, but we're still going to have that as a feature. So the group, and maybe I misunderstood your question. Once this works and once we can move issue types up to the group level, we will have a default object called group at epic level. But it will be based on issue type. That's that final migration point where we have to figure out the moving pieces of just moving it up to group or exposing those objects at group level.
One other question is, because we allow issues to be linked to epics, how that relationship work between epics and stories and features and so on? We do not allow, do we break the linkage between issues and the epics? Yeah. Do we just allow for issue type issue to be linked to the epics? What's the idea there?
This object is going to be deprecated. So in this plan, epic, as it lives now, and epic boards that run off that option, that different object from the issue type model would go away. So for 6 months to 12 months, however long it takes us to do this work, our customers will keep using their epics and their issues as is, and their epic boards. They'll have everything they need to keep their business running. We'll build the capability to have an epic on the issue type model, and we'll test it in the project space. Then we have to figure out, once issues can live at group level from the merging of groups and projects, then the questions you're asking around the migration, which would be that final step, actually migrating the epics. So they'll have a choice. The team to figure out how to do that. We could take what we've built here at project level, bring this up to group now, call it epic v2, and then do a migration of our current customers' old epics onto epic v2. That would be one way. I don't think we would merge these down I don't think we'd migrate them onto a project level epic, because our customers they are all built at the group level, so it wouldn't really make sense to migrate them down into the project.
Well, eventually that's where they will end up. It will just be sort of an extra step for them to press that migrate button. Well, the virtual migrate button, so to say. When we have the feature and the story, the epics will end up basically at either project or group level.
Yeah.
It's just like during the implementation phase of the feature and story and all that stuff, while we have both epic and the issue types, it seems like we would want to restrict epics to only be linked to a specific issue type, which is issue, so that we don't, like, we make life easier when we do this migration. Because if you start linking the epic with a lot of issue types or new issue types, then the migration might not be that easy. Where I'm not sure, I'm not envisioning it right now, but it seems to complicate things quite a bit.
And that's another, like, the epic to issue relationship for our customers. They should really only just see their default issues like normal for this process. If we want that to be called like the GitLab default hierarchy behind the scenes, and all of our customers just see epics relate to issues, And then maybe within our world, in our GitLab project, we could have stories as this new template. Like that's another way we could architect it, is have an alternate story to issue that's only exposed to our project. And then none of our customers would even see this object until it's ready to go. But that's a good point. Yeah, we would want to, just the way Epics right now can filter issue types that aren't, we have a lot of other issue types that show up, like test cases, requirements. They know to only pull the default issues. That needs to stay intact for our customers and not change at the group level.
So are you saying that is a story something that's really new, that's gonna be long-lived, or it's just a temporary migration point? I'm kind of missing that.
So the reason we chose it is, I'll show you here, that eventually, and I think I showed this last time. So currently our default is just epics and issues, or if you have multi-level on, it goes epics, sub-epics to issue. But our customers in portfolio planning want to do things like stack a template, like initiative, epic, story, task, like, or project epic, issue, task. We also have, there could be simpler models where you just have two in the stack. So where we're going with this is that the template needs to be, I called it customer created template, but the stacking of those items needs to be a part of this work that we're doing right now to figure out how these things come together.
But isn't that just custom issue types?
Yeah, it
That's
is.
what we're
It's just
talking
like,
about.
I think we'll come
Right.
up with some defaults. Brett, I think we'll come up with epic story with some default names, but they will be editable by user. They can redefine them if they want to.
Oh, yeah, I understand. So this is just custom issue types. Then this is not.
Yeah.
Story
Yes.
is just a custom issue type. It's not
Yes.
something.
Yes.
Everything's an issue type under the hood.
Okay.
And we called it collabjects for a while, and now we're calling them planning objects. Was a bit like generic, because the word issue type to our customer doesn't make sense, because they think about these objects like epics or stories, not as issues. But under the hood, it's our, yeah, we can call it whatever we want. They stay as issue types. And sorry, I didn't make that more clear.
So Kristen, to kind of tailwing on that, essentially the problem that you're trying to solve, the first problem you're tackling with this iteration is having a object hierarchy within a project, right? That's the essential goal of, like, if you only have a project, you can create a one level work breakdown.
Yes, you can have a parented story that can have issues as its children at the project level.
So hierarchical issues. Well, boiling it down into just what it is, it's hierarchical issues, right? Okay.
Yes.
Hierarchical
we
issues,
could-
and I think hierarchical types as well. I think we'll need to also define that this type can have children, but this other type cannot have any child types, if that makes sense. So
and
then we can-
eventually, yeah, the count, right? Like if this one could only go 7 levels deep, that's the other thing to think about. I can have children up, and I can also replicate myself up to 7 the way a sub epic does.
But we're saying
Okay, but
stories
that's
can
just
only
an
have
arbitrary
one.
limitation.
Yeah, it is, but
Yeah, single
stories
level.
can only have one level.
Just for, I tried to pick the simplest one. Yeah, so it would be a 1 level. We could also, we could choose to not do stories and make it issues as the parent, but there's a lot more people using issues. But we could go the other way and say the first thing we're going to do is do a task off of an issue. They're all going to do the same thing though, essentially. It's they're going to have children and they're going to have 1 level deep.
But can't we have hierarchical issues? I mean, I've been wanting that today, actually. I want an issue and I want sub issues.
Yeah, so you could just create that object. Once we have this model in place for your project, you could just create a new sub issue, call it sub
Right.
issue, and have it parented by a
But why-
normal issue.
Well, so I guess my question is, why are we bringing a new concept of story into this necessarily? It's really,
So-
we just need to add the hierarchical components that Epic has now into issues to give that ability, and then add the custom issue type stuff, and right, we'll get most of it.
So, I mean, we could, if engineering decides that that's the way it should go and we should do it under issues first, we could do that. From the portfolio planning team, because we're making this investment as well, and just like stopping 6 to 9 months of work, I need to be able to have new objects to talk about with our customers, how they're going to work, get their feedback. This is how they think. They think about stories, issues, and things like that around epics. So it makes sense from my standpoint to start with the one above it. And then also, no one's relying on that view yet. So it gives us more play in terms of having something truly new that we could turn off from everyone, and not even get into. We could work on this view page, and the issues would all be showing as children, and our customers could be none the wiser that this exists for a while.
Can you show the incident epic story diagram one more time?
It's initiative. Initiative is also like an epic,
Yeah.
but it's a single level.
So just so how I'm thinking about it. So in this hierarchy, Brad, if you can see it, it basically says that you cannot have story as a child of a initiative. So if you have as a customer, I think we need to allow them to define these kind of validations where you say initiative should only have as child epics, or another way to say epic can only have as parent the initiative, and story can only have as parent the epic, and you cannot have the story to have the parent as initiative. Is that correct?
But doesn't that, I mean, each of these custom issues are basically infinitely configurable. Because the customer can make them anything they want. They can change the name of the story to something else, unless you're making them first class objects in the system, which I don't know necessarily that we are.
No, but if you have an issue with type issue and an issue with type incident, right? You should not be able to make that issue type incident parent for the issue, right? So there is another level of validation on top of currently, because we have linked issues. You can create this hierarchy right now, and every single initiative epic story will just be an issue, right?
Yeah, but I can go in as a customer and create an issue type called bug, and then I can create, and I should be able to have tasks under that. So unless if you're gonna allow the customer to define the rules based on the objects that they create. No, I understand, but that's the endpoint, right?
Yeah. I think these are just going to come in as defaults so that we can replicate the epic behavior into some sort of a predefined structure, if that makes sense. And then we also can allow them to change it to whatever they want to.
No, I understand, but that's all built on an issue.
From a UX standpoint, the reason why also is because we'll have the new View app running on this new object. We'll do the new layout that Holly and Alexis have been working on. That will heavily involve getting the children in the right way so that it makes sense when you're doing a top-down plan that we have in epics right now. So just to be clear, the other thing is we're migrating onto View, we're getting this new layout, we're intentionally mimicking epics and getting this to this great point in the story object because those two are so similar. But yes, technically they should all work infinitely together at some point, and you could structure these in any way or call them whatever you wanted in the hierarchy. But we need to box in something specific that we're going after, and this is different in the sense that it is a specific portfolio planning parented object with a view and a roadmap beneath it once this is added.
Okay.
I will say I like the idea of a separate object just from the change management perspective, right? Like that way we're not touching issues or epics as we're building some of these new capabilities. So that's something to consider. And then also, I'll say, at least from my experience, like probably 80% of customers have a very specific mental model already around like stories, like tasks, stories, features, epics, right? Because of like the frameworks that exist out there. So if we build a pretty basic default model that's baked into GitLab with that, I think that's like 80 or more % of people.
Yeah.
This is this is a little confusing because we have, like, yes, ideally it would be a brand new object, but in reality on the back end, it's not. We're just extending our current issuables table. So I think to Brett's point, and you kind of went through the same thinking that I did, I think it's easier to go with hierarchical issues before we start worrying about like defaults, because we'll add an issue type for stories here, which will essentially just be everything from the issues table with just another param, let's say, that says it's a story. Do we really need to box that in on the back end side? Probably not. That's probably something we can figure out on the front end. Like if we want a complete separate UI for something that are stories, it can just be a completely separate UI for issues that that have a child issue, if that makes sense.
I started putting some words in your mouth, Donald, on the notes, but I think the way, Brett, I think like what you're saying is correct, and it's sort of like the implementation detail, whereas like what Kristen's proposing is maybe the framing of it from a product perspective. Like I think that if we, and not to trivialize what you're saying, like I think what you're saying is important. I just think that like we haven't yet done the figuring out of how we would implement this. So like think of story or whatever term in this as the concept of like, here's the goal we're trying to achieve, and it's to simplify so that we're not dealing with Epic, which carries a lot of current baggage and functionality around it. We're dealing with something new, and if that something new is an implementation of the issue type stuff that you've already been thinking about, then that's fine. Like that's a good approach to get us there, I think, is what, if that makes sense. I don't know if that helps clarify anything at all, but I think that like it doesn't, story as presented in the MVCs that Kristen put together, it's easy to think of that as like a new model or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's just a smaller, less risky box of stuff, whether that ends up being a type of issue or a new model or you know, whatever else it is.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think it's functionally equivalent to single level epics at the project level. Is that right, Kristen?
Yeah.
But I take
Project
Brett's
level epics.
I take Brett's
Mhm.
point.
Sorry, real quick,
sorry.
John. The only difference there, though, is that they will have issues as children, right?
But that's
Because
the
that's
same,
kind of a
right?
They
camp.
both have issues as children.
But right now, we can't have issues as children of issues, right?
Oh yeah,
Well,
yeah. But I
okay.
mean, functionally, it'll be the same as like single level epics at the project level, right? So there'll be an issue type that can have a relationship with other issues where that relationship is parent-child as opposed to related or blocked. I think that's the intention, right? And then we get a little closer to epics at the project level generally and sort of shrink that problem surface area a little bit further. But I would take on board like some of the things that Brett said there. Like when we do get to the point where we have custom issue types, are we going to allow customers to create a custom issue type and define what that issue type will be able to be the parent of? Like, so in other words, like I want a new issue type, it's an incident. Let's say we don't have that and I want to create that. It can have a story as a child. It can have an issue of issue type issue as a child. It can have
Yeah.
incident as a child, therefore it's multi-level. Or are we just going to say that allow the customer to define that this issue can have other issue types as children, full stop, right? Because the difference there would be that the latter is much more permissive. So if I don't get the functionality, in other words, that we've defined, i.e. incident goes to epic, goes to story, or initiative goes to epic, goes to story, goes to issue, and I really just want initiative going to a set of issues, I have to create a separate custom issue type for that and create that whole relationship myself.
I would say
Gabe shared some vision on that, where we define the types and then we define how those types relate to one another. So that's the kind of the end goal. Like iteratively how we get there, it depends. But I think he was saying that what we want to do is allowing customers to define the types and then allowing them to also define the relationships between the types themselves, which will kind of act as a validation on the actual issue object, right?
Yeah, and then us just having like templates that say, okay, for this way of doing project management, you have epics to stories to issues. But someone else can go in and say they want to have issues to epics to stories the other way around.
Yeah,
so
so
flexibility,
the template will create the defaults, but then they can go and edit and change those, customize the relationships in some sort of a setting page.
I mean, we're currently already working on putting custom issue types in play with a default set. So bug, feature, a couple other ones. So that's, you know, we have MRs open for that already that begin that process. So then it sounds like we want to be able to add the hierarchy on top.
the other thing to consider is we do still need to charge for and have gating around multi-level. And that's why I added that in as the second iteration, being able to go 7 levels deep of the same object. And that's up for discussion in terms of how we figure out the pricing, but that would be the other gate. It's just, there needs to be a reason to up tier for some of this. And that's up to product to figure out where those gates are around. But I just wanted to mention that because maybe if they're ultimate, they could go to infinity and then, but we would also have to make sure that the UI and the architecture supports it, because we've put a cap of 7 on multi-level right now. I'm not clear on why the cap was set, but maybe we should retain that cap or something like it and say, when you have a multi-level item, you can only go to 5 deep or 2 deep or 3 deep on it, plus the rest of the template hierarchy.
Definitely should retain the cap though, should not go unlimited. And the cap was really for performance considerations, mostly, to my knowledge.
Performance in UI, because in the epic tree, having more than 7 layers gets really taberific.
So just one final thing on this, Kristen, we might want to look at the MVC4 again when we know more about the project and group consolidation work, because MVC4, I guess, is where we step everything down from the group level to the project level. There's a possibility that those 2 levels no longer exist, or one of the other doesn't exist. And that would then raise the question of if it would make the data migration perhaps a little trickier, because we'd need to make the decision when we migrate people with multiple level epics, how do we do that, right? Like, do we automatically assume that everything above story is a feature and migrate all their epics that way? Or do we try to create some interactivity on their part where they can say, I want this mapped as an initiative epic story, that kind of thing? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Like, how do we make the assumption on their part?
Yeah, we can talk about that when we get a little closer, but that is a question to have, and whether they would just want them to stay. My assumption would be the majority would just want them to kind of stay as epics as is, but if we could allow them to choose the object, that could be very cool. I just want to be cognizant of it being small enough chunks for us to consistently do it, and then have a consistent, like if we leave it up to the user to make a choice, we end up supporting for longer the old object. Some people won't actually flip the switch and get over. So just we can talk that through, but whether we create a new object at group level on an issue type model that is called epic and we just move everyone, or we phase it.
It might make more
Yeah.
sense to, from a technical perspective, to do the stories first, then epics, then our multi-level epics at the project level as issue types, and then migrate everything, and then worry about all the other different types. So yeah, but hang on, because how do you decide which project to merge to migrate the epics to? Like, yeah, ignore that.
But all of these are fuzzy MVCs that I put up, so we can break. I put 4. We could break this into 7. We could have like you mentioned, all of our single level epic user customers be their own migration, then have a separate one for multi-level. Like we could get more specific and break these out. This is just the very beginning of the iteration in terms of how the MVCs work across the board in this issue too.
Real quick, the MVCs you have within this issue, within the proposal, MVC 1 is for project level object called story issue. Those are MVCs of the MVC, right? Not MVCs of the higher level.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what to call them, to be honest. I said the proposal is MVC 1 because before we just had it like epics as this whole thing going out in 6 months. So maybe I'll call it the initiative at the title, proposal initiative for project level object called story, and then the MVCs can be separate from that.
One question about the hierarchy implementation and issue types. I would expect that any parent-child hierarchy will be implemented as a reusable component, not directly on issue type. Did I get it right, or were there some other expectations?
I figured it would be
the point is that, sorry?
I thought it would be an issue link, but just with a new link type apart from related or blocked.
Yeah, that was my thinking as well, but I don't know.
Well, that would cause that. I would expect that parent-child hierarchy is different from relations, because I can imagine I can have issue blocked by something but still being parent-child of something else, but maybe
So the use case for both would be that, and right now we're calling them stories, but when we have initiatives going on around GitLab or other objects that could have, you might be working on this one issue that's increasing performance, but it's also like fixing a UX initiative, you could technically eventually have an issue be into multi of the same. I don't think we should tackle that in terms of the rollout of this, but we should keep that in the back of our mind that eventually,
yeah, sure,
we would support the multi-parents.
Yeah, I was just curious about whether we need a new issue type or not, because I understood this would be just another reusable widget or component. I mean, this parent-child hierarchy, same as we have, we will have either related issues or whatever we want. So then we can just easily configure for which issue types this hierarchy will be available and for which it won't. We can dive into these details later.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah, the parented, I have that in hot pink because anything in hot pink is kind of like new with this new object. That's something that does have to be figured out. The parenting widget or whatever we call it would be dropped into this new story object. Does it also start existing on test cases, requirements? These are the deprecated old epics and current issues. That's up for more discussion and more definition.
To your point, Jan, I think all other attributes or widgets are also available on all issue types. It's just we decide to show them or not to show.
Yes.
Right. So that's basically the same with the hierarchy. You decide on the issue type to either show it or not show it, but you have it available either way.
Yes, right. I mean, yeah. My another question was so during these MVCs, how user is expected to use issue with both having epics and story? What happens if he has both story and epic assigned? How is this expected to work together? I mean, what is the point for an issue to have both story and epic assigned, or how it will work?
Well, currently, I don't think there's like a strong use case to have it go into both. I could test it in our project if story's lit up. I could use that for a little more fine-tuned grouping of features within the project. But I don't think for the MVC, I don't think there's a case to have it go into both.
So then users would need to use either epics or stories.
Yes, and we wouldn't be encouraging them to use stories yet. That would be set to be minimal. Or we feature flag it completely just to us till we get these UIs all nailed down.
Okay, thank you.
But what would be the issue to having them use both? Like, why are you raising this? Like having the stories be as a kind of a, we can still keep the epics as a separate widget and component and show it in sidebar or wherever we want to, right?
Yeah,
and then having the so to say another widget or component called parent, which will show either story or any other issue type.
Yeah, I don't think it will be a problem. I rather have a mental issue to better understand how it all fits together and how it will work when epics are involved and user will use all of these objects together.
Yeah, it's a bit overwhelming, the whole vision to think about that like to the end, but that's probably, to me, that's the main problem right now, to break it down to next step. What do we do next to get us that much closer to that end vision? And I kind of phrased it, and it's like, it's a bit overwhelming to think about the entire thing and how we get there.
Also, we had a couple of chats with Imre from Manage team, and they are taking project group consolidation as a high priority now, and there should be some update on the blueprint, but there is some chance that this will move forward in let's say next months or next cycles. So we should take into account the chance that projects and groups will be consolidated into one, into the same object. Yeah. So.
I'll voice over what I what I put. I see you responding, Kristen. We can discuss, but I think having multiple parents for a single thing makes it confusing later down the line if you ever want to do reporting and attribution of work, right? And sort of slicing and dicing, because then it's like, well, where does the credit go to, right? Parent 1 or parent 2, or like how do you split it? It becomes complicated when you're thinking about these kind of like higher level executive reports. So my vote would be to have a single parent for an issue. And then if we want to have different ways that we can say like this is related to this or also contributes to this, it's like that would be my preference, right? But as far as like parent, it's much easier if there's one.
Definitely easier if there's one. And we're trying to keep that. That's what we have currently. I think we have to look at the multi-parent because there's our executive team has moved off GitLab into an OKR tracker and other things that let them do multi-parent, where you could have all of the issues like that we're working on in our features and our epics at GitLab. Like Christy has to then track them just through labels up into reports, and it's not effective. Whereas she'd love to have them be also going into her epics or her initiatives around UX OKRs, and then they go into ours, and then they go into the engineering OKRs. So they may be called something else, and then they wouldn't technically be a multi-parent, where you might call it an initiative. But it's something we have to look at for sure and just figure out in this new world, could we get away without multi-parent? Is there a way to do that? Or do we have to still light that up? But that's a big ask from their side that we've been trying to figure out from a portfolio planning space. How do we actually support our executive team in GitLab?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I agree, right? There's a need to like relate things and slice and dice, but as far, I think what is helpful to me in this perspective is like thinking about work breakdown versus relationships of like, what does this work contribute to, right? It's a little bit different, and we can talk offline. I should probably write down a bunch of thoughts about this, but it's different when you think of like, what's the high level, almost like budget sort of like item that you're chipping away to work on this thing versus what does this issue move the needle on, right? It's a little bit different. But yeah, let's discuss.
Yeah, and they're going off at that level. They're not using breakdown and weights, they're using counts, and there's like a different way. So for sure, we'll talk about it offline.
I don't know where we're at.
Donald,
I'll just ask mine there.
Yeah.
Oh, we're probably technically at time, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
We can go till the 30. What's my question? I lost track of it. So if we're sandboxing this for this MVC as stories, are we going to show? So is the plan then not to show stories within the issue view until down the road? Okay.
Where they would end up showing currently would be the same as an epic in the sidebar, where it would just be showing its parent, right?
Okay, so that might be a little weird then, if something is like if people are using epics and stories, then they would have both an epic and a story as parents in the sidebar.
Yeah, I think that if we end up doing this behind a feature flag, then it would be okay to have that and have it work on it for our own. Because like, yeah, this issue technically could go into both. Or we could start top down and just work on the story detail view, if that makes more sense to the team, and just look down at your children from that standpoint. That might be an easier way to get it up and running and not worry about confusing people for the first few releases. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, I would say we probably don't have any fewer questions than we came in with, but I think like we have at least some better direction, and we can, there's plenty of discussion too. I do think, and Kristen, thank you for kind of like, I think you echoed what many of us were feeling after the last time we talked about this, which was just sort of like an overwhelming sense of dread. So thanks for sort of like narrowing it a bit, and then we can kind of go from here to, you know, and especially taking into account some of the stuff that Brett and Jan were both talking about with regards to issue types. I think that also gives us an opportunity to kind of align this more practically with like stuff that we've already been doing and thinking about and we have code in progress for. So it doesn't necessarily feel like, you know, pivoting from a lot of stuff that we've already been doing. So I've noted, Jan, one thing with regards to your question on how we would, sorry, I just lost my train of thought entirely. But like whether the parent-child hierarchy should be implemented as a reusable component or something that has its own table or whatever it is. I think that's a pretty deep one. So we should break that out into if it's not already in the longer thread that Alexandria put together, and we can keep working on that. And then something that came up in my one-on-ones at least was the possibility of doing, I think we can make a lot of progress on these discussions asynchronously, but you know, should we continue talking about this synchronously? Some of this stuff is big and hairy enough where it feels like easier to talk about synchronously, but it's also hard to get all the viewpoints we want. So I don't know how y'all feel about that.
And Kristen, I just wanted to say this this all looks pretty good. I'm sorry, I'm my head's already down in the nitty-gritty details and stuff. So
Thank you. I
I'm looking
appreciate
up and
the
you're
input.
looking down, and
It's all good. I think we're all trying to get to the same place. And any feedback, even if we do it async in that issue, if we can break those MVCs to smaller, please let me know. I'm also, if you want to, like Jake just suggested, if we want to keep doing sync calls, like on a weekly cadence or bi-weekly until we get some really high level decisions made about next steps, I'm game for that as well. I'll defer to the EMs and the engineering team to figure out what that cadence should be. We've been doing bi-weekly meetings with design just to get some rhythm. But I do think we need to hear what are the top level decisions. We need a list and have they been made, and start just ticking those things off.
Maybe Kristen, a next step would be to kind of like outline what those boxes that need to be checked are, and then like figure out how many of those can be done async versus synchronously. One thing that I don't know, and this is the hard part about iteration, right, is like how much do we need to agree on MVC 2.3 versus 1?
1, I think, is the main push, because we can change 2 or 3 once we have more information. This just kind of sets a tone. So I'll draft an a list for the engineering team to fill out in terms of like, what are the high level decisions? I know last week we made one, it was that we're going to stay on the issue table. That was the one thing I pulled out of the notes. But if there's open-ended decisions to be made around the parenting widgets or things like that, let's just get it into one place so we can see some bullets on that, and then we can organize around it.
Kristen, could you see Alex's issue to see if that sort of fulfills that requirement? Like ideally, if we're going to have sync calls, ideally the questions would start as topics in this issue, and then the lack of resolution would mean that it requires some synchronous discussion. But if we can resolve them asynchronously in the issue, then we should just try and close off as many of these as possible.
Okay. Yes, I'm looking at that right now. So the way this one is structured, this one. Yep, so we've got all of these down below. We need a resolved comment team.
Yeah, I don't recommend getting, studying too much of the finer details of how this will be designed, but undoubtedly, like some of the decisions will be contingent upon product decisions as well, and some of the outcomes will be so like borderline that the product requirements might actually tip one decision either way. And the good thing about Discodo is that it should put everything into the into the issue description, like summarize all the main points in the issue description so that you don't have to go down through the discussions and through all the more
Whoa,
technical discussions. Yeah.
really? This is cool. So
Yeah.
this is programmatically created. Okay. And what do
Should
these little
we-
things mean right here?
I wasn't able to watch that far in the tuitional
Oh.
video on Discoto. For some reason, it kept freezing for me, so I'm not quite sure what those mean. But
Okay.
yeah, I think like if there's a point that somebody wants raised, like so that everyone outside of the technical discussion can see it, they'll add pro or con in front and the point.
And point.
Prefix that causes it to be entered automatically into the issue description. So the description should always be a summary of everything, of the main points that we're talking about in the discussion.
That's
And there
really
is
cool.
the outcome keyword or something that will just display underneath the topic in the description, saying that this is the outcome for the topic if we agree.
Okay.
Something. So that should be easy to parse within the description.
Okay, so these are all of our open questions that need to be solved, and then status on those is ongoing, and we'll figure out if we need sync calls to talk through some of them. And then I'll figure out sort of when because we have to start scheduling for 14.1. We need to figure out what we're scheduling. Are we scheduling spikes? Can we get some of this work started to do this MVC of a story? That's going to be the implementation issues need to be written and created and scheduled. So hopefully we can move fast once we've got some of these decisions made.
Yep, cool.
This looks great. Thank
right.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a great week.
Everyone,
See ya.
bye.
Bye.